turned out not only to be complete nonsense, but also to be an insult to people who died in the Mont Blanc tunnel fire in, I think it was 89. Because that's when this directive was introduced by the EU Commission in the hope of avoiding similar tragedies. So, he doesn't just put his foot in his mouth when he speaks, like he maligned the memories of everyone who died in the Grenfell Tower tragedy by suggesting that they died because they didn't have common sense. It's worse than gaffes. It's worse than foot-in-mouth territory. He ends up actually insulting the memory of people who died in tragedies, and he's done it twice now. Once could be an accident. Twice looks like a tactic. 11:49 is the time, and back to questions regarding Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, the perceived legality or illegality of it, and then possibly, if there's time, back to Liz Truss's rather infelicitous vocabulary in the House of Commons yesterday. Professor Mark Elliott is a professor of public law and chair of the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge. He's also something of an evangelist when it comes to making law more comprehensible for the masses, in which category I very much place myself. You can see some of the work he's done in that field at publiclawforeveryone.com, and he's even got a YouTube channel, but everyone's got a YouTube channel these days. And it is to this question of necessity that I draw your attention first, Mark, because you drew my attention to it earlier today when you described Robert Buckland's intervention yesterday, a former Lord Chancellor, of course, as extraordinary and sad. This is the international law doctrine of necessity, which the government contends justifies what they did in the House of Commons yesterday, albeit that many of their own MPs, including the former Prime Minister Theresa May, don't think that it fits that criteria. Let's start with what the criteria is, if we may.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the reason that I said that about what Robert Buckland said in the House of Commons yesterday, I'll just read you his tweet if I can. So, he said this, I'll read you what he said in the Commons. A lot has been said, he said, about necessity as if it requires imminent peril. Well, here's what the International Law Commission says it requires. It requires that the state is safeguarding an essential interest against a grave and imminent peril. So we've got the former Lord Chancellor in the House of Commons saying that it doesn't require the exact thing that the International Law Commission says it does require.
With the exact same words. That's at the end. That's why I'm afraid I guffawed, because the phrase "bang to rights" almost doesn't do justice to this, does it?
No, I just don't know how he could have said that. Really, perhaps there's some more subtle point that he's making that just has evaded me. But it seems to me that he's just making a completely incorrect claim about what the law is, and this is not a controversial point. It's there sort of on the page, as it were, in the International Law Commission's articles on the state responsibility.
And he goes all in on it as well. Necessity in this context doesn't require that degree of imminence, except, as you pointed out, it does. What it requires is a degree of real threat and a growing evidence of a real threat to those essential interests. And he goes on to say, I would argue that there is that growing evidence. I suppose we'd have to wait for him to explain what he's talking about there. Could you give us a precedent? Could you give us an example of when the imminent peril or the necessity argument has been deployed in the breaching of treaty obligations in the past?
So I think the key thing is that it's very, very difficult to see how it can apply for two reasons, really, both looking at the text and thinking about how it's been applied before. The first thing to say is that in order to plead necessity, this is kind of obvious, but it's got to be necessary. And that means that there haven't got to be other less sort of drastic things that you could have tried, but which you haven't tried.
Like negotiations.
Well, yes. The very obvious thing that the UK government hasn't tried is Article 16. So Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol says that there are circumstances, they're pretty limited circumstances, But there are circumstances where the UK can take unilateral action. It's called safeguard measures. And there are various restrictions around that. But basically, if the UK has reasonable grounds to say that the protocol is causing serious problems, there is a mechanism built into the protocol to allow them to take steps to resolve that. Now, it's very hard to see if they haven't bothered to do that, and it seems that they're saying they're not going to bother to do it. It's very hard to see how it can then be necessary to sort of go for the nuclear option of just legislating to try to override the protocol. And the other problem is that you haven't got to have contributed to the situation that you're now complaining about if you want to invoke the doctrine of necessity. And of course, the UK agreed to the protocol less than 3 years ago, and it's now complaining about things that the government foresaw in its own impact assessment.
I'm no lawyer, but that sounds to me as if, I'm just wondering, in your experience and with your knowledge, you've ever seen quite such an egregious attempt to evade legal reality? Because I mean, I was aware of one or two of the points that you've just made, but when you take them in their entirety, it's as if they've I choose my words very carefully because this is very important territory, but it's as if they're wrong in every imaginable way.
Yes, I think I find it really difficult to understand how somebody who understands the law could really take this kind of view. So, I mean, the government, when it published the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, it published a legal opinion alongside it, which I guess comes from the Attorney General, and it says some comparable things. And again, I don't really understand how they can say what they say.
Well, not least because the actual words imminent peril, as you pointed out at the very top of this, are contained within the criteria for deciding. When you can, just to take you back, if I may, to Article 16, who decides on those reasonable grounds? Is it an autonomous? Is it a unilateral decision by the UK government, or is there an overarching scrutiny of whether or not the reasonable grounds for triggering it are in place?
Well, I mean, so the UK would have to be in a position to show that it had a reasonable basis for thinking it needed to take those sorts of measures. If there was a disagreement about that, then there are mechanisms in the protocol itself to resolve that. And in fact, you can't invoke Article 16 until you first entered into consultation with the EU through a special process that's laid down in the protocol. So I think ultimately the reason that they don't want to go down the Article 16 route is both because they can't really know what the outcome of that consultation would be, but I think also they want to drive such a coach and horses through the protocol that actually Article 16 is too limited to allow them to do the kinds of things they want to do. So they've sort of gone for the more drastic option of just saying it's necessary, in our view, to basically just override the thing.
So, I mean, for the avoidance of doubt, this is an attempt to legitimise the absolute abandonment of the treaty obligations that they signed up to just under 3 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. So the withdrawal agreement, which the protocol is part of, is absolutely crystal clear. It says that we have a binding treaty obligation to give effect in our domestic law to relevant parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And basically what the bill does is it says, we're going to define lots of bits of the protocol as excluded, and then we're going to say domestic law can now ignore those bits of the protocol that we've excluded. And the basic problem is you can't legislate through national legislation. You can't legislate your way out of binding treaty commitments. Otherwise, the whole edifice of international law would just collapse.
Can I tempt you then into the realms of speculation? What do you think is going on here? Because there are two options as far as I can see. They either didn't understand what they were signing, or they didn't think that the other signatories would hold them to what they agreed to. Is there a third option? And if not, which one do you think is in play?
I don't think there is a third option. I'm not sure which of those two it is. I think all I would say is this fits, I think, a bigger and more worrying picture where the government is showing itself to be very resistant to things that constrain it, whether that's EU law, whether it's the European Convention on Human Rights, whether it's ministerial standards, whether it's our domestic courts. I think it does form part of that bigger picture.
But whether it's treaties they signed themselves.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Good grief. And finally, Mark, this, I suppose, is a silly question, but you're not in any doubt, I don't think, about the legality of this. What does it do to us on the world stage? What sort of message? Theresa May alluded yesterday to a sort of diminishment of our standing. How does that work in real terms?
Well, I think it must, and I think in terms of our standing to encourage other countries to abide by international law, whether that's in terms of human rights or other things, it clearly impacts on that. I think it also calls into question whether we're a reliable partner in things like trade negotiations, because we're showing through our actions that actually we think that when it's not convenient to us, it's somehow okay to breach our obligations, and that's just not how you would expect a country like the UK to operate.
I don't know that this is a compliment, Professor Elliott, but this is one of the most remarkable interviews I think I've ever conducted, simply because of the absolute absence of any mitigating factors at all. Your clarity on the egregiousness of what this government is doing is complete, isn't it?
Yes, I'm not hedging what I'm saying in a lawyerly way, because I'm pretty sure that it's kind of
that's what I mean.
It's clear cut. Yeah.
Well, thank you, I suppose, Professor Mark Elliott, the Professor of Public Law and indeed the Chair of the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge. So obviously, he's no Suella Braverman. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. I was going to talk about nightclubs, would you believe, now, for two reasons. Number one, to express my sympathy with the nightclub goers in Oxford who witnessed Matt Hancock on the dance floor. Actually, I can't do that. I'm 50. I know if you saw me on the dance floor, you'd probably laugh yourself silly. Following Michael Gove, of course, who famously arrived at a nightclub in Aberdeen and tried to avoid paying the £5 entry fee by stating, "I'm the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster," which could have come straight from the pen of Ben Elton and Richard Curtis, couldn't it, when they were writing Blackadder? I'm the Bishop of Bath and Wells. But Lisa Nandy suggesting, I bet I've lost this story now, that one way to level up towns may be to reopen nightclubs. And I just love that story, and we may get onto it. But I think we need to do a little bit of post-match analysis. I genuinely found that interview astonishing. And Mark understood why, I think. He alluded to it towards the end when he stated that he hadn't been loyally in his analysis, as in lawyers are normally, and this applies, if not more, to lawyers in academia than it does to lawyers in courtrooms, they are not normally certain, or rather, when you're teaching case law in particular, you absolutely have balance and mitigation. That I'd lost count. I wish you could see the scrawlings that I deploy sometimes when I'm interviewing people. It's normally, I saw Andrew Marr's scrawlings the other day when I was down in his studio recording something, and they're surprisingly similar to mine. I always think that the proper grown-ups like Andrew Marr are probably taking shorthand notes while they're doing interviews and referring back to, but he's like me, he's drawing little castles and funny pictures and stuff like that. It's just a sort of form of distraction. But on that one, I started trying to keep a note of all the reasons why this government is behaving abominably from a legal perspective. And you had Robert Buckland's complete misrepresentation of imminent peril or the necessity defence. But then you also had the failure to trigger Article 16, the fact that you can't really claim that you have no choice but to do this until you've tried every other avenue when they've avoided negotiations. The fact that they contributed, the idea that they didn't contribute to the mess that they're in when they actually caused it, and it was predicted in their own impact assessments. I genuinely lost track of all the reasons why this is a particularly heinous piece of legislation. I genuinely lost track. I thought there'd be one or two points that I would now hit you over the head with before we moved on to talk about nightclubs. But there were almost countless examples. Well, they weren't countless. They were quite easy to count. There were 4 or 5, but I lost count because I was trying to keep up while also conducting the interview. That was an amazing, amazing contribution to public discourse by one of the leading legal academics in the country, in the world, actually. If you're the professor of the Faculty of Law at Cambridge University, you're one of the best legal academics in the world, professor of public law and chair of the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge, describing what the British government is doing in terms that we would once perhaps have reserved for the leader of a banana republic. I don't know that I've got anything else to ask you or anything. I just feel that we shouldn't move on yet. We should just reflect for a little longer on what we were just told. And you can see why he used extraordinary and sad contribution to the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, second reading by the former Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland. It's one of those days where I am tempted to ask people who will not phone me why you still don't care. I know you're out there because you send me occasional incoherent texts. How can you still not care about what's going on? And then you get your answer. You get your answer by looking at America. You get your answer by looking at January the 6th. You get your answer by looking at Liz Truss, call people who point out the reality of what she's doing by inferring that they're not, or implying that they're not patriots, they're not patriotic. I'll read this out from Peter because it's a compliment to everybody who contributes to the programme. It says, James, I'm a lecturer in sociology and history. I have to thank you for the service you provide. Your analysis and guests are second to none. Your show is a breath of fresh air. Thank you, Peter. Not even a PS about my microphone technique either. You need to have been listening earlier to understand that. I'm always honest with it. I can't believe that interview. I can't believe that this is so obviously and so blatantly a breach of international law. And to hear Professor Elliott there tie it in with that refusal to be bound by ministerial codes or the refusal to be bound by the European Convention on Human Rights. It's just this refusal, this petulant, adolescent refusal to be bound by anything. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking back to that bloody school report, aren't you? Where Johnson was literally described as believing that he is somehow exempt from the standards that bind everybody else together. I'll get the exact quote in a minute. But that's what he's now doing to the country. He's trying to render the United Kingdom an entity that is not bound by or the government of the United Kingdom, an entity that is not bound by standards or requirements, responsibilities, or, in this case, treaties that they signed 10 minutes ago. It's incredible. It's objectively incredible to be seeing the most acute and expert of analysis portraying the government of these islands as now being irredeemably dishonest and disingenuous. It's actually incredible. 10 minutes after 12 is the time. The phone lines are open. I feel we can't talk about nightclubs. Give me a ring and respond to that interview you just heard. That's all I've got. Seriously, I can't do all the heavy lifting. It's time you did some work. 0345 606 0973. I'll take a couple of calls that were referring back to Liz Truss because we didn't do a full hour on that. Why did Liz Truss use the word patriot in the House of Commons yesterday to describe herself while she was defending and seeking to enact legislation that is not only illegal, but illegal in almost every imaginable way? Chris is in Bournemouth. Chris, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning. Yes,
that's how long you've been on hold. It was morning when you rang in.
Since last Thursday.
Go on.
I'm only kidding. Honestly. Just a slightly different dimension, perhaps, is I think Liz Truss was talking to probably the most importantly for the Ulster Unionists sat on the opposite side to her. The DUP, as everybody knows, were absolutely almost slaughtered in the last election. And during the debate, the SDLP representatives were heckled by Geoffrey Donaldson, telling them that they'd lost a third of their vote.
Right.
And Colm Eastwood very quickly reported, well, you may have lost the union. And what this is about is the unionists need to sell something to their hardcore and to their population at home, that the protocol is this big problem, that this protocol is something that the Parliament in Westminster is going to do something about. So you and I both know that the House of Lords will completely and utterly stop this, one would hope.
Yeah.
And whatever happens.
You've got 50 Tories who abstained, and so which means they're of the view that it's breaking international law, and they couldn't bring themselves to vote against it. I mean,
Theresa May abstained.
Yeah.
So did Boris Johnson, because he wasn't there.
Sure.
So did Simon Hoare, who is chairman of the Northern Ireland Select Committee. So all these people are speaking from very far from the sidelines about how difficult and complicated and how erroneous and how it breaches international law, but at the same time won't actually do anything about it. But what the unionists fear, what Jeffrey Donaldson, who, as we all remember, when the protocol was first brought up, even though he opposed it, he actually said, well, it doesn't, constitutional change is not threatened by having a border down the Irish Sea. He actually said that. So the Article 16, your previous caller, who I was quite worried about following, being a professor,
Sure.
is actually, Brandon Lewis has said that he will repeal Article 16. He will just eradicate the protocol via Article 16. And obviously that can't happen. So they need to do something completely and utterly erroneous and
so something devoid. Something immune to scrutiny, something entirely autonomous.
Yeah.
Article 16, that's the thing that Mark explained, would involve assessment, and they'd have to prove their case. But here, they can just vote their case.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be correct. They just, it's a bit like saying, put your hand up if you think the moon is made of cheese. 52% of people in the room put their hand up, and you conclude that the moon is therefore made of cheese. That's where we are now.
And,
it's possibly where we are a while ago.
as we all know, the 6 counties of the north, as Kate Hoey has said, was sacrificed during the Brexit debate. And actually now they have to honour their promise, which Paisley has said was made to him by Boris Johnson, that there won't be a sea border and we will look after you. So, just keep shut up. Just shut up about everything. And they have, really.
Yeah, and listen, the DUP, although they'll see this as a win, are unlikely to go into government. It's not going to see them trotting off back into Stormont, which means 6 months down the line there's another election. They'll be hoping to do better than they did in the last one, which you've just referred to. Their failure in the last one is a key reason of where we are. But that, that postpones the business of government for another long period of time. What happens next, do you think, then, given your clear understanding of some of the bigger issues?
Flatterer. What I would say is, as we head towards July the 12th, Liz Truss, Brandon Lewis particularly, continue to fan the flames of potential violence in the 6 counties.
Gosh.
And I think we've seen burning buses, but we've seen the likes of, some of you may be familiar with Jamie Bryson, a loyalist who got something like 167 votes when he stood for an election, who doesn't represent anybody, but is mysteriously walking with Ben Habib, with Kate Hoey, and seems to be very close to Jeffrey Donaldson. One has to wonder, I wish some journalists would find out.
Those are Brexit Party people.
How is he funded?
I don't know.
He's unemployed.
Well, hang on. I don't know enough to let you speak uninterrupted on this. I know the name, and I've seen some of the behaviours you describe, but I don't know enough about him to go any further down that particular road. But what you're suggesting is a sort of a dark and worrying casualness about what might be at stake here.
Yes, and it is very well believed that basically the Conservative Party dumped the Unionists. Thanks very much for all your votes, and thanks very much for supporting Theresa May. And we promised that Brexit will look after you, and then just dumped it in order to deliver Brexit. because ultimately what they
the
want
Brexit
is
they're
a
now
hard
trying
Brexit.
to disown, and then of course you're then left with the knowledge that the DUP didn't really want the Good Friday Agreement in the first place, and that's when things get scary. That's Michael Gove wasn't a fan of the Good Friday Agreement, if memory serves. So there are all sorts of wheels turning, none of them pretty. Thank you, Chris. It's 12:17. It is 12:19. Have my techers been better today? Has anyone noticed? Have I been a bit better on the old microphone techniques? I haven't. I can't do it all with my arms folded because it makes me sound like a football manager. But I have. I've taken on board that rather, I thought, unhinged criticism but then all my colleagues started nodding along. I thought it was unhinged when I read it out, but then all my colleagues started nodding along, and one of them even applauded. So apparently, I just treat the microphone like a kind of punch bag sometimes. I've never actually hit the microphone, but no, not I mean deliberately, but I sometimes grab it and pull it towards me when I feel that I'm about to say something profound. I'm not suggesting I ever do say something profound. I simply said when I feel that I am about to say something profound, I sort of grab the microphone like I said, come here. So I've been a little better. I've also tried to sort of hit the desk less. I hope that the gentleman who wasn't wearing his high-quality headphones is appreciating the efforts that I'm putting in on his and indeed everybody else's behalf. 20 minutes after 12, we will get that interview up on. In fact, I think it's just about to go. This interview is one of the most remarkable interviews I've ever conducted. James O'Brien is blown away as Professor Mark Elliott explains why the government lacks legal authority to dump the Northern Ireland Protocol. That is absolutely about to go live because that was genuinely, and I've done a lot of interviews over the years, that one truly smacked my gob, as it were. 21 minutes after 12 is the time. I'm sure you can see why. We go to another Chris, I think. We go to Chris in Cambridge, and then we'll head over to Stratford-upon-Avon. Chris first. Chris, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hello, James. Long time on I hope I make myself as clear as you always do, because I'm always kind of blown away by what you say.
It's not me. Go on.
The thing I wanted to say was I'm just about old enough to remember the Good Friday Agreement being signed, and whilst I don't sound like it, I grew up in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
Moved here when I was about 5 or 6 years old, just as the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And I remember my mum and my dad being literally, it was party time in our house when that agreement went through on the referendum, and not only went through with 71.2%, I think it was, of a majority. And actually, it's brought lasting peace in Northern Ireland and in Ireland as a whole. And the thing I'm worried about here is, and again, my father's no longer with us, but my mum definitely is genuinely concerned that with the government doing what it's doing, it's going to send Ireland back into the 70s and the 80s with the violence.
It's a real fear. Does your mum think they're going to blunder into it? Does she think they're going to blunder into it, or does she think it might even be the plan?
Well, I don't vote Conservative, but even though I don't vote Conservative, I find it very difficult to believe that a serving Prime Minister would deliberately go down a route that would cause violence. What I do think is happening, and my mum's kind of in a similar position, we just think that they're blindly following this idea of Brexit to all avail. And
to the exclusion of all else, including now international law. Nothing else matters except keeping the balloon inflated.
Yeah, and that's kind of where it's like, it's almost like they've got the blinkers on, like they're following blindly. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who dies. It doesn't matter what else happens. It doesn't matter what laws you break. It doesn't matter whether you lose a couple of by-elections, because we've got 2 more years and we're going to get it through. And no matter what happens, this is the only thing that matters, because it's what Boris got elected on. But it's like they don't realise that the Good Friday Agreement, and I can only talk about the Good Friday Agreement because it's my heritage, my history, all the rest of it.
Yes.
But that was a hard-fought peace. And it's still a very tense peace. As far as I know, like the idea was for the peace walls to start coming down. I don't believe they have yet in all places. And they still keep the peace in Northern Ireland. And, the peace
that is being potentially jeopardised. I don't think that is a difficult position to defend now. I don't think that's a controversial opinion. I think it is being jeopardised, whether intentionally or not. Yeah. I don't know, but it doesn't matter, does it? Jeopardy's jeopardy. I
live in Cambridge now. I've lived in the UK for 24 years now. But I've got cousins, I've got aunts, uncles, all the rest of it that are genuinely concerned. And I've got a lot of my family still lives in Derry, which of course is where an awful lot of the violence was happening. And people like, I mean, my dad moved us over here when my sister was born. Essentially, his idea was, I don't mind bringing up a couple of boys in Ireland, but I'm not having my little daughter put at risk. Incredibly sexist, but it is what it is, the situation.
Or paternalistic, shall we say, to give your dad a break on that one.
There we go. That's why we moved over here. But and we ended up living in Enfield for a long time, and now I live in Huntingdon, actually. But there's a lot of family that are genuinely concerned, and
but then there are people on the DUP. There are people on the DUP side of Northern Irish politics who are persuaded that the fact that it is now more difficult to transport goods from London to Belfast than it is from London to Birmingham is actually diluting their identity and damaging their sense of self. And I think that's the problem, Chris. That all of the rational arguments don't seem to matter in the face of the emotional ones, which isn't just true in Northern Ireland, it's true across the whole of Brexit. People feel something which it doesn't change according to the facts. You know, you can change your mind when the facts change. It's a lot harder to change your feelings, and people feel they want to feel persecuted, or they want to feel discriminated against, or they want to feel sovereign, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. It's just bizarre now, and Northern Ireland looks like being the sort of laser focus of that tension. What do you think is going to happen next? Do you have a view? You don't have to answer that question.
I have a hope that common sense will prevail. I have a hope.
And what does that look like?
It looks like following the law, James. It looks like actually opening up the Good Friday Agreement, opening up the Northern Ireland Protocol, and thinking what matters most. Does it matter most in the world that it might be a little bit more difficult to do a couple of things, or do people's lives matter? Do people's actual living, breathing bodies matter more than it costing an extra few pounds or an extra few euros or an extra couple of days?
Well, I think you're younger than me, and you've still got a little bit more optimism of youth, perhaps, because, you know, it's not just the politics of it, it's the entire lives of some of the key figures involved in unionist movements, unionist politics in Northern Ireland that you are now relying upon, we are calling upon to act with a bit of good sense and sense of compromise. And of course the EU could move a little bit on this as well, but they are unlikely to when the negotiating partner has just given itself the right to tear up the last thing they negotiate. Would you like to come in and renegotiate with me? Oh, by the way, you remember that last negotiation we did? We just, 10 minutes ago, that one, David Frost, we stuck him in the House of Lords because he did such a bang-up job. We've just given ourselves the unilateral right to tear that up and throw it in the bin, almost certainly in breach of international law. Fancy taking a seat and having another little round of negotiations with us? I mean, this is just nuts. And as Theresa May pointed out yesterday, from personal experience, I should add, that when you've been the victim of unpersuasive confidence vote, so you may well have won it, but the damage done by the scale of people expressing an absence of confidence in you, that's not someone you're going to want to negotiate with, because whatever is agreed is being agreed with someone whose own grip upon leadership is fragile. This is madness. It's incredible. It's quite cathartic just to get it out sometimes, isn't it? Rather than just sit there spluttering and marvelling at the speed with which this country has become a basket case. Robert's in Stratford-upon-Avon. Robert, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First of all, I just wanted to say thanks, really. I wanted to echo some of the comments of other people have made.
Of course.
What this radio program does is opens up discussion about compassion and social justice and democracy, and that's very difficult in England nowadays. So, first of all, I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
The other thing I wanted to say was about fascism. I don't think Liz Truss or Boris Johnson are fascists or Nazis.
Nor do I.
But recently, I've been reading some of Professor Richard Evans' work about the history of Germany.
Yeah.
Some of the most shocking stuff was, in the 1920s and early 1930s, the Liberal Party, the Centre Party, the Nationalist parties, but also in the military, the civil service, student groups, a whole range of ideas were already developing. Nationalist ideas, anti-democratic ideas, racist ideas, supremacist ideas. And these people weren't fascists. They certainly weren't Nazis. And they couldn't anticipate what was going to happen next. But these ideas were becoming sedimented for many people in German society. And I think what the Tories are doing, in a very pragmatic and populist way, in a very stupid way, is they're preparing the ground for something worse. And I don't know they're doing
accidentally. Because they are pursuing, and I think the analogy I'm going to run with for the foreseeable future is that Brexit is a balloon, but they have to keep it inflated. Eventually, it will be a sort of grubby, burst, deflated thing that no one could believe was ever so huge and bouncy. But it is still a balloon, and they're putting all their energies into keeping Brexit inflated, that they're not noticing what they're losing in the process of doing that, or what they may be ushering in the process of doing that. Patriot was an ugly moment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Patriot.
And I think, and within that context, certain groups don't really matter, do they? Refugees, asylum seekers, the fishing community, the agricultural communities.
Farmers,
and of course,
hospitality sector, lorry drivers.
The people in Ireland, and the people in Ireland need to know this, they don't care about them at all. I think there was a survey of Conservative Party members fairly recently indicated they didn't really mind what happened in Ireland.
What do they care about?
There could be a united Ireland as long as they got Brexit.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of ongoing racism towards a whole range of different groups, and that towards the EU, towards Irish people, to refugees, those poor people in the boats, that's so important. But it's also dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I mean, make Britain great again by literally abolishing the United Kingdom has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? But you're right. I think there was some polling that showed broad support for that. Robert, thank you. Thank you for the kind words as well. They are richly appreciated, and there are a lot of them coming in at the moment. And I can only do what I do with the help of the people that do it with me, both my colleagues and, of course, my callers, and the occasional guest, like the most astonishing guest I think I can remember talking to in a long time, Professor Mark Elliott, who was on earlier today. 5:30, and, of course, the newsreaders who adorn the programme in the way that Amelia Cox is just about to with the headlines. It is 33 minutes after 12, and Liz Truss has been in front of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, covering herself in almost as much glory as she did yesterday. I'll steer you back from the interview I did with the head of the law faculty at Cambridge University, which essentially portrayed the British government as behaving in an almost unbelievably illegal way, not just a little bit illegal. Can you have gradations of legality? Is it like being a little bit pregnant? I don't know, but there were like 3 or 4 different grounds for concluding that what they are doing with this Northern Ireland Protocol bill is absolutely outrageous. Not just 1, not 2. Do I hear 3? I'll give you 4. And I don't have the answer to the phone-in problem. How do we keep talking about crazy stuff that's been done right under our noses without getting repetitious or even, God forbid, boring? I don't know. I guess that's what they bank on. Oh, God, look, James, we know the government's completely corrupt and breaking the law, but for goodness sake, will you just talk about cycle lanes, please? It's just crazy, right? But I'm going to have to trust my instincts. As long as I keep feeling it is urgent and compelling, I'm going to have to keep hoping that it's urgent and compelling. 12:34 is the time. And back to Liz Truss as well. Theo will join us shortly to talk about her latest excursions. But why did she use the word patriot yesterday, if not for the grimmest of reasons? 03456060973. Stephen's in Telford. A lot from the sort of Midlands today. Stephen, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you doing?
Very well. What's on your mind?
I think that the Northern Ireland problem is quite simple, really. It's clear that, in general terms,
yes.
I think this is very simple for the government. There's a part of the UK, Brexit, hasn't had full effect yet and is actually working. And in the rest of the UK, it's terrible. And the government cannot have a part of the UK that is showing that, without the, in inverted commas, Brexit benefits, that Brexit doesn't work.
I'm always wary of, if you like, master plan theories. You know, the old cock-up versus conspiracy idea. And I think this lot, I fell into this trap during COVID. Most of the time it was cock-up, not conspiracy, that explained their catastrophic decision-making and delays. But on this one, I think it is actually about appeasing the DUP and trying to get Stormont back up and running. I think if the DUP would only be quiet and accept that Northern Ireland has the best of both possible worlds, I think that the UK government could live with that, actually. I don't think they're desperate to keep everybody's eyes away from Northern Ireland, because history teaches us that most of Great Britain never pays the blindest bit of attention to what's happening in Northern Ireland anyway. So that's why I would disagree with you, but only on a sort of 52-48% divide. Stephen?
Yeah, I think the whole patriot thing is completely to play.
Oh, we lost you there.
Yeah.
No, there's something
Have
gone
we?
wrong with the phone line, but you got your central point across. I may come back to you shortly. James, it can't be that boring if your ratings are as high as they currently are. You speak for many of us that don't have a voice anywhere else in the British media. And another one, that guest of yours made the government look so stupid and arrogant. Well, I think you're right. 12:36 is the time. Theo Osherwood is here, unsummoned. What's going on?
Because, of course, the Prime Minister is flying from the G7 to in Bavaria to Madrid for the NATO summit, and he's just said that the G7 world leaders are unified against Russia. Back here in London, though, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has been taking questions or answering questions from MPs on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee this morning. The highlight was this exchange with Chris Bryant, the Labour MP for Rhondda, who was asking Liz Truss, well, if we're going to impose sanctions against Russia, we're not going to deal with authoritarian regimes. What does that say about our relationship with a number of Gulf states?
What I would say is that Saudi Arabia is an important partner of the United Kingdom.
81 executions all on one day in Saudi Arabia. And you don't think that that's an authoritarian regime?
What I'm focused on is making sure that we are dealing with the major threats to the world. The number one threat we're dealing with at the moment is the threat from Russia. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we have alternative energy sources. And one of the key sources of energy is the Gulf region. We're not dealing in a perfect world. We're dealing in a world where we need to make difficult decisions. And I think it is right that we build that closer trading relationship with the Gulf states.
If a country is an authoritarian regime, it's fine to do business with it as long as the authoritarianism is only within its own borders. Is that right?
What we're facing with Russia is a regime that is actively seeking to invade sovereign nations and create a greater Russia, recreate the former Soviet Union. What we're seeing with China...
Yeah, but we went hand in cap to them for 12 years, and now
wrong.
We're doing the same with Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think that was wrong, the approach that was taken to Russia by the West. It was wrong.
Liz Truss, James, in that same exchange, and apologies, I haven't brought it to you.
I think I've got it here. Can we get that other clip ready as well? The one where she talks about raising issues with Gulf leaders all the time, about the Chris Bryant as well on form again. Good grief! I mean, is there a defence of that? I mean, under the pragmatism goes, we've got to get our fuel from somewhere, and one of the reasons why we've managed to be so up front with regard to Ukraine is because we're not reliant on Russian gas in the way that other European countries are.
And the point that Chris Bryant is making is that, well, we did business with Russia for 12 years, and then we now find ourselves in the situation we do with Ukraine. Ukraine finds itself in the situation that it does, and shouldn't we apply the same logic to those Gulf states when it comes to being more circumspect about doing business with them? And Liz Truss is saying, well, we've got to get, as you say, we've got to get our energy from somewhere. We've got to do business with them, even if it ends up being a mistake potentially in a few years' time.
You know what she should have done?
What's that?
She should have just said that the leader of Saudi Arabia is a patriot, and that is why he does what he does, because that apparently is a catch-all defence for any accusation or allegation. Why is Chris Bryant not on the front bench?
He was chair of the Privileges Committee. He
still is, isn't he? He's just recused himself for that one investigation.
Himself from that investigation, yes, of course. He's highly rated amongst his Labour colleagues. Sometimes there isn't the opportunity at a particular time. I don't know whether
I said that to you off the top of my own head, and then I glanced at my screen, and 3 people have actually sent that into the programme as well. Ryrie being the one at the top of my list. Incredible.
Sometimes it doesn't always work out that a leader of a particular party will promote talent to the very top of the party.
No, well, I don't think Starmer falls into that category. No. Maybe Chris Bryant enjoys himself more. I'll ask him. We should get him on the podcast, actually, shouldn't we? Yeah. Should we get Chris Bryant on Full Disclosure? He'd be a really good one. He's an excellent episode last week. Have you heard it yet with my Chris Patton interview?
I've heard all about it, James.
Very good answer. Very good politician's answer. That's because you're a patriot. Have you listened to any of my Full Disclosure series ever?
I listened to the one you did with Angela Rayner.
Was that it?
No, I listened to the one you did with Wes Streeting.
There's about 50. What about the non-political ones?
Oh, sorry, James.
There's some great showbizy ones as well. What about the one with Tim Roth, Hollywood superstar?
He was in Pulp Fiction, wasn't he?
Unbelievable. 12:41 is the time. Theo Ashford, thank you. I'm going to play the other clip because I like the bit about. Like isn't quite the right word. So Liz Truss's spokesperson has been pretty clear that there haven't been any particular interventions on human rights with Gulf leaders. And Liz Truss has a slightly different memory or interpretation of facts. This may gloss over some of the ground. It may revisit some of the ground that Theo just steered us through. But it's been happening while we were on air, so it's certainly worth a little look back. Have a little listen to this.
In the Gulf trade document that you just published, you say the government will continue to hold those who violate human rights to account. How are you doing that in the Gulf states at the moment?
Well, these issues are raised regularly with the relevant ministers and leaders who we meet in the Gulf states.
You have
what
personally?
our aim, I have personally, yes.
Well, your spokesman said that you hadn't. So what's the last human rights issue that you raised with a Gulf state leader?
I'd have to come back to the committee on the precise timing of that, but I certainly
anything.
have
Just
raised
tell us
it.
anything that you've said on human rights.
Well, I certainly have raised it when I was in...
Go on, tell us one now.
I'm just trying to remember my most recent visit, but I can assure you I have raised it, and I will write to you with the details.
You can't remember a single human rights issue that you've raised with a Gulf state leader?
Oh, I've raised particular issues when I've been in the Gulf about
name
human
one.
rights issues. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details of private conversations, which I will come back to you on in due course.
I'll name one.
Wow. Rule Britannia, eh? I'm going to play that again because it is every bit as staggering as some people suggested to me. It also reminds me of work. It's a bit like a Brexit caller ringing in back in the day and saying that he couldn't wait to get rid of all those pesky EU laws. And I would say, go on, name one. And they'd say, well, all of them. And I'd say, yeah, all right, one of them, just one. Your favourite. Give me the law you can't wait to get rid of. The reason why you're voting to impose economic sanctions upon yourself and limit your freedoms, abolish your own freedoms, damage your children's future because of these laws, these awful, awful laws that you have to obey, that you don't want to obey. What are those laws? I don't. Is anyone else reminded of that? Is Chris Bryant doing any of my holiday cover while I'm away? Do we know? We don't know yet. It's all the top secret, high-level negotiations, way above my pay grade. Wes Streeting was a bit too good last time. I hope he's got ambitions to be Prime Minister, because otherwise I reckon he'd be snapping at my heels trying to get my job if I wasn't. You don't want your holiday cover to be too brilliant. Have another listen to this. I think Chris Bryant should definitely get a go when I'm off on my holidays.
In the Gulf trade document that you just published, you say the government will continue to hold those who violate human rights to account. How are you doing that in the Gulf states at the moment?
Well, these issues are raised regularly with the relevant ministers and leaders who we meet in the Gulf states.
You have
what
personally?
our aim, I have personally, yes.
Well, your spokesman said that you hadn't. So what's the last human rights issue that you raised with a Gulf state leader?
I'd have to come back to the committee on the precise timing of that, but I certainly
anything.
have
Just
raised
tell us
it.
anything that you've said on
well,
human
I
rights.
certainly have raised it when I was in...
Go on, tell us one now.
I'm just trying to remember my most recent visit, but I can assure you I have raised it, and I will write to you with the details.
You can't remember a single human rights issue that you've raised with a Gulf state leader?
Oh, I've raised particular issues when I've been in the Gulf about
name
human
one.
rights issues. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details of private conversations, which I will come back to you on in due course.
I'll name one.
It is 12:48 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've got a couple of woke watches for you. Hopefully we'll have time to do them. But poor old Struan in Falkirk has been hanging on the telephone. It's like a Blondie song, this programme, sometimes. And so I shall speak to him before I do anything else. Struan, are you still there?
Yes. Hi, James.
Hello, mate. What would you like to say?
I'd just like to say that this whole thing with Liz Truss, it's just yet another. The Conservative government just does whatever they want without regard for any sort of rules.
You actually got censored then. I think it was accidental, but your phone line went a little bit down. I don't know whether Keith is now in the employ of Liz Truss to keep the most coruscating criticism from the airwaves. But let me just take you back to when you just said it's another example of.
It's another example of how the Conservative government does whatever they want without regard for any sort of international rules or regulations. Another example is Rwanda.
Yeah, I don't think they're breaking the law on Rwanda, but of course by pulling out of the Dublin Convention, it robbed us of the ability to send failed asylum seekers back to countries that they had come from or come through. That was another consequence of Brexit that, of course, they can never explain honestly in Parliament. And I'm looking not just at the international things, but also the domestic ones, like most obviously, I suppose, the Code on Ministerial Standards. It's incredible, right? It is just breathtaking. Why did she use the word patriot?
I think primarily because she was backed into a corner and doesn't have any sort of valid answer as to why she's doing something.
It's not much of a silver lining. I think you're right for what it's worth. It's not much of a silver lining, but you go through life with some quote, some figures of speech that you use quite frequently and quite glibly. You never really stop to think about what they mean. I wish I could think of some other examples. I probably will at about 3 minutes after 1 today when I'm on the bus home. But that phrase, patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, or as Umberto Eco remembered it, patriotism is the last refuge of cowards. I knew it was good, but I never understood exactly what it meant until Liz Truss stood up and did it. Stood up and showed me exactly what it means in the House of Commons yesterday. Because as Struan just explained it, when you're backed into, you've got nowhere else to go. That's what it means. The last refuge of a scoundrel. The last refuge of cowards. Where else can I possibly go? I've been presented with incontrovertible evidence of my own awfulness. And indeed of my government's criminality or illegality. I never know what the difference is between doing something that's illegal and doing something that's criminal. Is there a difference? We should get ourselves a barrister. Apparently they're really cheap. That was a joke. It was a joke. That's it, isn't it? That's what you do. Here I am, presented with incontrovertible evidence of my own personal awfulness and my political corruption in the context of illegality, breaking international law. Where else can I possibly hide? Where can I possibly go? There it is. The last refuge of a scoundrel is patriotism. So should we play that clip again? The Hillary Benn Liz Truss exchange. This is it. This is it in action. If you just excuse me for a moment, thank you, Struan. I've got. I'm just going to Google something because I've got a horrible feeling that last refuge of a scoundrel, like a lot of my favourite quotes, will turn out to be apocryphal, and he probably never said it at all. Happy days. On the evening of the 7th of April. 1775, Dr. Johnson made a famous statement. He said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. It was not as is widely believed about patriotism in general." Now, I always understood that because there's nothing wrong with patriotism in its positive and pure forms. But it was what he saw as the false use of the term patriotism by William Pitt, the first Earl of Chatham. And off the top of my head, if he's the first Earl of Chatham, maybe he was Pitt the older. Pitt the younger would have been the second Earl of Chatham, but I don't know for sure. That is it. There it is. Here it is. So Dr. Johnson, talking about William Pitt in 1775, foresaw Foreign Secretary Liz Truss in 2022. When you've got nowhere else to hide, when you're down to your final refuge, who are you going to call?
I suspect that when she was campaigning for Britain to remain in the European Union, she never in a million years thought she'd be standing here proposing a bill of this sort. In the light of the comment she has just made about Article 16, why is the government not proposing to use the legal method to raise these questions with the European Union through the treaty that it signed, rather than one claiming necessity, when the Foreign Secretary is yet to give me a single example where the British government has claimed necessity for abrogating a treaty that it has negotiated and signed?
Well, Madam Speaker, the reason I'm putting this bill forward is because I'm a patriot and I'm a Democrat.
Whoa. And of course another one is that Orwell line, isn't it? About the party told you to ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most terrible command. And you just think, oh yeah, that's a bit spooky. Well done, George. And then you live in it. You actually see it. You see Kellyanne Conway come out and say alternative facts. And a quick apology to Struan on the question of the legality of the Rwandan thing. Of course, it hasn't been decided yet. It has yet to be judged to be lawful. That's coming to the High Court in 2 weeks. a quick word with Ben in Brighton and then a woke watch. Does that sound okay? Yeah? Is everybody happy with that? Ben, what would you like to say? Why did she say patriot? Why did she say patriot?
I just wanted to introduce into this discussion, which has been fascinating, I just wanted to introduce the notion of the thought-terminating cliche, which is a term that is used, I think it was first used in a book in the 60s talking about totalitarianism, specifically the Chinese Communist Party. But you hear it everywhere. Once you're aware of this term, and you can probably tell from what it means just from what it says. It's a thought-terminating cliche. It's something that's used to end the discussion.
Give me another example. Have you got? I'm not putting you on the spot like Chris Bryant did Liz Truss, but have you got another example of one?
How about get Brexit done?
Okay, right.
But you come across it in lots of places. You come across it in a lot of religious, especially quite high-controlling religious organizations, cults. Use them a lot. If someone says it's God's will, what can you say to that?
What do they say in Gilead? What do they say in Gilead? What do they say in the
under his eye?
Under his eye,
or blessed be the fruit. Yeah, once you're aware, it's one of those terms that once you were aware of it, you start to see them everywhere. And I think this current government is.
Oh, you're very good. And that's the technical term, is it? What's it called? A truth-denying cliche.
A thought-terminating cliche.
Right, I'm adding that to the list. That's going.
Stick it on the list because I'm sure you'll be finding them left and right because they really are everywhere. And patriotism is a classic one. I mean, as a lot of people have talked about already, it's just it's a flag you can wave to shut down everything, and there's no real way to.
We have to fight back. Then we have to fight back. We have to refuse to let our thoughts be terminated, and we have to keep pointing out the awfulness of what is being done under our very eyes.
Keep thinking.
Keep thinking. It's good for thinking is good for you. And I promised you hours ago to remind you of that quote. I think he honestly, here it is from his own teacher at Eton Mastering College, talking about your current Prime Minister. In a letter to the current Prime Minister's father, I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. So now we're living in a country where the network of obligation which binds everyone else includes international law, ministerial standards, and quite possibly refugee-based legislation. I can squeeze one of these in, I think.
Woke Watch.
This is a story all about how my life got flipped. No, this is a story about poems, and I wasn't going to do it. It got nominated for Woke Watch last week, and I ignored it until yesterday's conversation about why on earth an English government would be seeking to restrict the teaching of English literature. And it reminded me of Nadeem Zahawi's curious intervention when it was revealed that one exam board was revising slightly its curriculum of poems that would be taught, removing one by Philip Larkin and one by Wilfred Owen, but keeping poems by all manner of other classic English poets, including William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, Emily Dickinson, and introducing some new ones from poets who are still alive, the British Jamaican poet Raymond Antrobus and a Ukrainian poet, which is topical. But understandably, it was served up as an example of a culture war by people who wouldn't know a poem if it sat on their face, and presented to you as yet more evidence that your culture is under threat. So Nadeem Zahawi, an education secretary in a government that is blamed by one university in Sheffield for its suspension of the English literature course, suddenly discovered a passion for English literature and tweeted, "As a teenager, improving my grasp of the English language, Larkin's poems taught me so much about my new home. We must not deny future students the chance to make a similar powerful connection with a great British author or miss out on the joy of knowing his work." Anybody who has come across Philip Larkin without having it taught to them at school apparently doesn't exist, according to Nadeem Zahawi, and I can recite the entirety of Ambulances and This Be the Verse without even drawing breath. Don't worry, Keith, I'm not going to do it now, not least because Sheila Fogarty is in the studio. It occurred to me that if Nadeem Zahawi, the Secretary of State for Education, in a government that is blamed by Sheffield Hallam University for the suspension of its English literature course, truly did think that poems were a good way of teaching people about the country in its current state, then a poem, and I think the Larkin poem they used was an Arundel Tomb, which off the top of my head would have been written in about the 1950s by Philip Larkin. So under Nadeem Zahawi's own desperate attempt to utilise anti-woke nonsense in order to bolster a confected culture war and pretend that he's somehow defending the masses from an assault upon our values, he's claiming that you need to read a poem written in 1956 in order to get an idea of what the United Kingdom is like today, rather than a poem that was written, for example, today. And that concludes this morning's
Woke Watch.
I'm out. Here's Sheila
I
Fogarty.
think you need to go and write a poem.
I think I might.
I think you should
There
go
once
and write
was a
a
man
poem.
called Nadine. He was not all that he seemed.
Oh, Lord, he's doing it.
They made him a minister.
As the secretary. Yeah, you're going to need to work on that. 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 You're going to need to work